right, I'm going to go ahead and welcome everyone. If people could please mute themselves, that would be fabulous. You can hover over your picture and it'll offer you the opportunity to mute yourself. My name is Lisa Affelberg, and I want to welcome all of you to our webinar. I am the director of Shamayim Jewish Animal Advocacy, and I'm going to tell you more about that in just a minute. When I first met Rabbi Isaiah, whom you're going to hear from in a little bit on this call, we were talking about Passover, and I posed the question to him about whether or not we are truly free if others aren't free, and in that I include animals. So we decided to create this webinar to explore that and invited some other partners. So we're going to look at a lot of different avenues of exploring that. I want to thank my fellow leaders and speakers today, and they're going to each introduce themselves and their organizations to you as they speak. But we have Melissa Hoffman and Alana Braverman from the Jewish Initiative for Animals. We have Sarah Eifler from Jewish Veg, and we have Rabbi Isaiah Rothstein and Hannah Henze from Hazon. Before I turn it over to Rabbi Isaiah, I want to tell you about Shamayim, Jewish Animal Advocacy. We are a nonprofit organization that runs programs and campaigns and educational opportunities to teach the Jewish community about animal advocacy and veganism. And you'll hear more about our programs at the end. We are expecting quite a large group today, which we're absolutely thrilled about. But because it's going to be so large, we don't feel that we can have everyone introduce themselves and go through everyone like we would have wanted to, so you could all meet each other and know where each other are coming from. So we're asking if you feel comfortable that you go to hit the chat button at the bottom and just quickly type in your name, which we can see a lot of your names, where you're calling in from, and something that you're hoping to learn about through this webinar. So welcome again. Thank you so much for joining us. And I am going to turn it over to Rabbi Isaiah from Hazon.
Hi, friends. Lisa, thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I know it's pretty crazy times. The world feels a little bonkers at the moment. And I think the fact that we're in many ways encouraged to not be around in public settings, we obviously do have an opportunity to come together. So it's special that we get a chance to come together around things as important as this. So first, what I'll say is that we know when Adam and Eve were given the prescription from God to steward the world, the line from the Bible, from the Torah says, "Vayave el Adam liros ma yikra lo," that Hashem took humans basically and told them that they had a responsibility to have a very deep, intimate connection with nature by naming things, specifically maybe a strength that humanity has that no other species can do, and maybe that's like a good conversation in its own right. So on that note, of naming things and putting symbols. And I think, like, in philosophy, there's other symbolism and language of what that might mean. But in the Jewish tradition, we have this idea of putting names to things and what that might actually represent, the symbols of those things. And even the word davar or dibor, right? Like words of Torah, dvar Torah. The word davar is in that. It's like it's tangible. It has something to it. So that being something that's already in the human capacity to name things, the question that to start as a frame for our conversation today is what are the names of Passover? How did we even acquire this name of Passover? And I would just as we're beginning to think of Passover, Purim being 2 days ago, I guess that makes the Passover night 28 days from now. Maybe someone else could give me the exact countdown, but I believe it's coming close. And as we know, the rabbis tell us that we should prepare for the holiday 30 days before a holiday. Shloshim Yom Kodem L'Chag. We'll also have this idea of preparing for the holiday of Passover in our 28-day countdown. So with that, I was going to actually share my screen.
It's already shared.
So yeah, I have like a source sheet that I was just going to scroll with. Great. Okay. And I'm just going to give that. Awesome. So great. So I just wanted to start with like different names for Passover. And We have, I mean, there's a few that I've written down. I would be so curious if there are others that people were considering. But there are different names in the Torah or from the rabbis for this holiday. So the first that I would share with you is Lil Shimurim. There's a line in the Torah in Exodus, kind of right after the plagues and a real climax in the dramatic like sequence of events of the Exodus. Stories that I don't know if you've seen the movie The Prince of Egypt, that's like a great visual for that experience. I highly recommend it. I think, as they say, everyone has an obligation, right, to say these three things at the Passover Seder, and that's how you fulfill your obligation. Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. I also think that watching The Prince of Egypt should be on that list. So anyway, Leil Shimurim, a night of anticipation. This was a translation that I once heard, and what Rashi writes is Leil Shimurim, this word Shimur, it's really saying like something that you really care about, like the word to be shomer something, to be caring for something, that it's sacred, that it's separate, that it's something that you hold on to. So this word of anticipating something is the language of shomer umitzapeh, that you're guarding it, you're keeping it close, and it's something of this night, the Passover Seder. And we know actually the Pew study showed that out of any Jewish holiday, where there's most representation, where people show up, it's actually the Passover Seder. I believe the 2013 Pew study showed 70% of the Jewish community shows up for the Passover Seder. And I'm sure we would have a really cool conversation of what is it about the Passover Seder night that makes it this Leil Shimurim, a night that people want to really mark as sacred, as separate, and in anticipating. The next one, number 2, is Chag HaMatzot. We have a line from the Torah. There's several lines in the Torah. It says, it's Chag HaMatzot Tishmor Shivat Yamim Tochal Matzot. It's called the Chag of Matzot because we eat matzah for 7 days. And the rabbis actually say that it's really the first day of Passover during the Seder. That's like a biblical commandment. And then the rabbis say that this line of, it says Chag HaMatzot Shivat Yamim Tochal Matzot, but then it says Yom HaRishon, and on the first day you eat this matzah. So on the first day, but nonetheless, it's called Chag HaMatzot as a holiday. And the symbolism of the matzah and why we might call it Chag HaMatzot. And, each of us in our lives, and I'll say this again as we continue down in this order, might feel differently about how we are in our world today, and in our relationships to the Jewish faith as a whole, let alone the holiday of Pesach. Sometimes it feels like a Leil Shimurim, but sometimes it feels like a Chag HaMatzot. And in that way, there's the idea of brokenness that we know is associated with matzah. It's a symbol of slavery, of vulnerability, of not having a lot. It's bread, it's flour and water. It can't rise, right? This idea of humbleness, humility. So that's another frame. The third one that we have here is Chag HaAviv. More specifically, as it says in the Torah, is Chodesh HaAviv, the month of Aviv, this first month of the year. And some of you might be familiar that the Jewish calendar cycle, unlike, let's say, in Islam, it's a lunar calendar, it's by the moon. Or in Christianity, it's a solar calendar, or Gregorian calendar, it's by the sun. But the Jewish calendar is as a lunar-solar hybrid, specifically because Pesach is the Chag HaAviv. It needs to take place during the spring. So that's another frame for Pesach, this idea that, and so the lunar solar calendar and how they align and how we set up our leap years to make sure that Pesach happens when things are blooming and when life is being seen and restored in a certain capacity in the physical way. I mean, we know that even in the cold of winter, these trees are alive and well. If we just take a minute to check them out. I know it's harder if you live in cities. I live in New York City, so that's its own world. Number 4, we have the rabbinic name. We'll see in like the Kiddush, the formal prayers that we say, Zman Cheruseinu Mikra Kodesh Zecher Li'Yetzias Mitzrayim. That's like Zman Cherutinu Chag HaCherut, a time of our freedom, specifically thinking about the lines of the Exodus narrative around being freed. And then coming to specifically the final name that I have written down, But then I would love if anyone has another name that they're thinking of, I would love to just throw it out there. Even put it in the chat if you'd like, or yeah, in the chat would be great. So the final name, Chag HaPesach. So that might be the name that you've heard of. You might be thinking about, oh wait, so this last one, Pesach, right? That's like the name that Jews have been calling this holiday for thousands of years, right? And this is the name that, you know, people in the Shoah during the Holocaust, like, you know, set up systems where they would trade their bread months before the holiday just so they only had potatoes, you know? So they would set up rations to, you know, thinking about, and then also in the most beautiful ways, like those desert Pesach experiences under the night sky. Like, think about the crazy experiences that people have had for Pesach, and why is it called Pesach? Why is it called Chag HaPesach? So the text that we have here, it's another name, and colloquially this is the name, Pesach, Passover. We call it Pesach for the reason that you might say it's because during the plague of the final plague, God passed over, and there's different, and it's true that there are different sources in the Torah, but specifically there's also was a sacrifice, an animal sacrifice. Thinking about the frame for our webinar today, it was an animal sacrifice that, you know, and there's a lot of Hasidic thought and meta philosophy of Judaism on like what was this Paschal lamb specific to the Egyptian culture and Egyptian society, but also how it existed within temple sacrifice. The Paschal sacrifice, it was tied to the bedpost. It was something that, unlike all the other sacrifices of the Torah, was not required in a place of the tabernacle or the sanctuary. It was actually meant to be a communal sacrifice. It was something that if your name wasn't on the list, so to speak, you weren't able to participate. But in our world and today, into thinking about how people even get their meat, I don't think people have the relationship that the Torah even was necessarily intending for the Pesach sacrifice. But what I think is interesting is how did it become that this would be the name for the holiday? And I think that on this call, and even the four organizations as we came together, we all were coming with very different frames of like the relationship to meat and the reasons for, against, neutral, whatever it might be, all of us on this meeting, like our relationships to what we might think about when we realize that the name that we've owned for thousands of years as the marketplace name for Pesach, for Passover, is Pesach, is Chag HaPesach. And it's true that we do have the other frame, which is of being passed over or being able to pass through the sea, this idea of going through. And the Hasidic masters actually say that Pesach is a joining of two words, which is Pesiach, that the mouth opens, that when you're a free person, you have expression, and when you're a slave, your expression is nothing. But with the frame that we have, I think what it beckons us to think about is a reframe of, we know that in general with the Jewish tradition, and as we continue to understand society at large and recognizing systems of oppression that exist in the world, when we look at society and how society is imperfect and equity is messy, and talking about climate justice is messy, and like trying to think about this virus that we all are struggling in different ways with is messy. And I think that when we think about Chag HaPesach, recognizing the deep sensitivity and the needs for our world at large, specifically also as it relates to workers, to animals, and to the climate and justice and what that might mean. So yes, Chag HaPesach, it's a frame there. This is the last thing I'll say, and then I want to hand it over to hear from my friends and colleagues about different parts of this work, and specifically starting with Melissa from JIFA to share a little bit more about workers. But I'll say that Pesach, I think one of the reasons maybe the rabbis chose for the holiday to be called Pesach is because when the temple was being destroyed, and you'll note that in the Haggadah, there's narratives of the Tanaim, the rabbis who basically were in the last era of temple Judaism, where there's narratives, their narratives are there, their stories. We know that the story of Pesach is a story that we want to tell, but their story is in the Haggadah. And I think one of the frames is that how would when it became a norm for Jews to go to Jerusalem for Passover, and offer the Paschal sacrifice, how would people remember Jerusalem? It would be through this name. It would be through the name Pesach, because Pesach would be associated as a sacrifice, but specifically also associating it to the communal gathering in Jerusalem. And so at the very least, the name, I think, also has the symbol of showing up in Jerusalem 3 times a year, as was claimed in the Torah, and we're the entire nation. Men, women, and children, people would go to one place, literally one location. I think that's another frame that the rabbis were intending, that we would be reminded of what that was like when truly the Jewish nation was truly united. So with that, I'll hand it over to Melissa. And thank you. And
thank you, Rabbi Zaya.
Sure.
I'll intro myself and JIFA as we get situated with the slideshow. So I'm Melissa Hoffman. I direct the Jewish Initiative for Animals, or JIFA. I'm here with our program manager, Alana Braverman, and we work nationally with Jewish institutions to support them in aligning their Jewish values with their food choices and encouraging them and supporting them in adopting ethical food policies. So I'm personally based in Los Angeles. Alana's based in Chicago, and we work with institutions across the country. And I'm really excited to focus on the labor aspect of this conversation. I think it's very much part of our DNA as a project to talk about the various intersections with animal agriculture. And some of the facts we'll be presenting may not be new to you. And even if they're not, they can be kind of difficult to hold during a celebration period. But I think Passover lends itself well to us wrestling with these issues and giving us the opportunity to live up to our name, Yisrael, the people who wrestle and ask questions. So I'd like to offer this primary text from Sefer Dvarim, from Deuteronomy chapter 24, more as a framing rather than a proof text. You shall not oppress a hired servant who is poor and needy, whether he is one of your brothers or one of the strangers who is in your land inside your gates. At his day you shall give him his wages, nor shall the sun go down upon it, for he is poor and his life depends upon it, lest he cry against you to the Lord, and it be a sin for you. So there are many laws governing the relationship between employers and employees in Jewish tradition, and they generally aim to create a balanced working situation where each party gets what they need. I just want to highlight a couple of things here. Who is this law addressing? The employer, right? The employer enters this partnership with greater power, and so Jewish law spends more time defining the requirements and responsibilities of the employer rather than the employee. And what is the employer meant to do? Regardless of whether the workers are of the same tribe or community, so if they're outsiders or immigrants, as long as they're on your land and they are poor and in desperate need of making a livelihood, you must treat them with consideration and pay them on time because their life depends upon it. So looking at the broader landscape of U.S. agriculture today, here's what we know. Animal ag employs about 700,000 workers annually. A large percentage of factory farm workers are people of color, including migrants from Mexico and other parts of Latin America. Their responsibilities include, among other things, administering antibiotics, castrating animals, performing mutilations such as cutting off beaks and tails, treating or killing sick, injured, and weak animals, and transporting them as well. Agricultural employers are exempt from paying many of their workers minimum wage and or overtime in many or most cases. Slaughterhouses and meat processing plants also employ a high number of people, about 500,000, similarly from vulnerable populations. A large percentage are people of color and or people living in low-income communities, and their responsibilities include killing, bleeding, cutting animals to break down the animal and separate fat, muscle, and bone. There's an extremely high turnover rate. These are not jobs that anyone wants to do. And most workers are at-will employees, meaning that they can be fired at any time for any reason at the discretion of their supervisor. And this work requires long hours and causes repetitive stress injuries to a worker's hands, wrists, arms, and back. A worker might repeat the same forceful cutting, hanging, pulling, or trimming motion more than 20,000 times a day. And even though there are laws in place to guarantee workers a healthy and safe working environment, there are predictable risks here. There's exposure to multi-resistant bacteria and other common health issues such as the ones listed here. And the pressure of improving line speeds also contributes to worker injuries. All right, so the agri-processors plant in Postville, Iowa, which many of you are maybe familiar with, was formerly run by Shemot Rabbah, and during his time as CEO, it grew to be the largest kosher meat producer in the US. It produced about 60% of kosher beef and 40% of kosher poultry nationally at its height. This place was really rife with problems and was subjected to numerous investigations, including an undercover investigation from PETA that revealed workers ripping out tracheas and esophagi from cattle while still conscious after shechita was performed. There was also documentation of fraud, environmental violations, sexual abuse of workers, and lots of other labor violations. Ultimately, it was an immigration raid, though, that bankrupted the company in 2008. And so there's a lot of different responses to Postville and academic work that has come out analyzing what happened there. But I think the main message we can take away from Postville, and the most important lesson about injustices on factory farms, is that issues that are so rarely isolated or specific to any one given area of the industry. If bad things are happening to animals, or to the environment for that matter, bad things are usually happening to people too. Another aspect of labor that I'll briefly touch on here are the contract farmers or growers who raise animals today. Poultry farmers and increasingly pig farmers are tied to these vertically integrated business models controlled by powerful corporations. So despite their massive output of chicken, many poultry farmers live near or below the poverty line. Farmers enter into contracts where they own the equipment used to raise the chickens, and corporations own the chickens. So John Oliver, who did a main story segment on this topic on his show in 2015, made an apt summary of the situation. Corporations own everything that makes money, and farmers own everything that costs money. But perhaps the most depraved part of this system is the way farmers are compensated, which is a tournament where farmers are pit against one another, sometimes against their own neighbors. And those who produce the most chicken on the least feed are compensated at a higher rate at the expense of those lower on the ladder. The entire system is designed to impoverish farmers, diminish or eliminate the production sovereignty, and in the whole process also strips them of any say in how they raise their animals. The man on the left here, or sorry, on the right here, Craig Watts, was a former grower for Purdue. And around 2014, he decided he'd had enough and invited people in to document the conditions on his farm. And he's been a vocal critic of contract farming ever since. So thinking back to the teaching that it's incumbent upon a working society to ensure the welfare of our laborers, especially those that are most vulnerable to exploitation, what more fitting time than Passover to consider how we engage workers' rights in our food system? And here's a little sneak peek of a resource that we're putting out later that'll come out in the form of a supplement for your Seder. In the story of Passover, even more than at any other sacrifice, participants in the Korban Pesach and the Paschal offering demonstrated that their animal consumption was part of a web of violence, painting the lamb's blood on their doorposts to protect themselves from the bloodshed in Egypt. Today, the welfare of humans is also wrapped up in the fate of animals raised and killed for food. Most laborers who work in factory farms and slaughterhouses are vulnerable immigrants, people of color, and poor. And few of us interact with or bear witness to this web of violence. So the first question here is kind of more of a spiritual challenge. Does the consumption of factory farmed animals separate the consumer from mass violence, or does it draw us into that culture and numb us to the brutality of it? How does our participation in this system through the choices that we make affect us? And does our distance from it and the people who suffer make us culpable and numb us to the abuse? And then going back to the idea that in a perfect values-aligned world, it is really the employer's duty to protect workers, how do we respond as consumers to their utter failure to do so? And how do we protect those who are most vulnerable? So everybody can take a deep breath. I'm going to take one too. These are larger questions and difficult ones that I hope you'll discuss at your Seder and future opportunities with your close people and among your communities. And now I'd like to turn it over to Sarah from Jewish Veg to explore more of the animal aspect of animal ag.
Thank you, Melissa. All right, so I'm Sarah Eifler. I'm from Jewish Veg, which is a national nonprofit that inspires and assists Jews to adopt plant-based diets as an expression of Jewish values. And I want to talk to you, as Melissa said, about the animal aspects of animal agriculture and animal justice as it relates to preparing for Passover. Specifically, I'm going to talk today about two elements of the Seder plate, and that would be the shank bone and the egg. So next slide, please. So I want to start by telling you a story, and that is of how Moses was chosen to be a leader of our people. And so according to Midrash, the story goes that Moses was tending a flock of sheep in Midian outside Egypt, and one of the lambs ran away. And Moses, of course, followed her, and he found her eventually drinking from a pool of water. And Moses's response was, "I did not know that you ran away because you were thirsty." And then seeing how far she had run, he said to her, "You must be exhausted." And he lifted her and placed her on his shoulders and carried her back to the flock. And at that moment, God said, "Because Moses has shown this compassion to this lost lamb, I know that he will show that same compassion to my people, to the people of Israel." And so according to Midrash and Jewish tradition, our greatest leader was chosen specifically because of his compassion for animals, and in this case, a lamb. So how does that compare to the reality of what happens today? So this is a graph to show you where generally the shank bone and lamb and sheep meat come from in the United States. The dark bars are imports in millions of pounds. The blue bars are exports and domestic production. As you can see, essentially all of the lamb and sheep meat in the United States is imported. Approximately 540 million sheep are slaughtered each year for meat worldwide. The imports that we get in the United States come from 3 countries, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And in 2018, which is the last year we have the numbers for, 273 million pounds of sheep meat were imported to the US, most of it from Australia. And so some common practices in Australia include surgeries such as mulesing, docking, castration, and tagging. This image is of mulesing. And that is a procedure where patches of skin are removed from around the buttocks of a young lamb, a sheep. In Australia, that and other painful procedures are legal to perform without pain relief for animals under 6 months of age. As lambs are generally slaughtered between 4 and 12 months of age, that's the majority of them. And so the practices that are performed upon the bodies of these animals are performed generally without pain relief, and they are done in a way to limit the cost to the farmers rather than to protect the animals. I also want to take a moment to name the fact that in order to continually produce more lambs to be slaughtered, invasive breeding procedures are necessary in that case to perform upon the bodies of female sheep, to keep them pregnant, to keep them producing more sheep, which is obviously extremely painful for them as well. Another practice that is common in Australia is live export. Now, the United States does not allow live export from Australia. However, the same farms that are providing the imported meat from Australia to the United States are also performing live export to countries generally in the Middle East, and that includes Israel. And so I have an excerpt from an article here from one case in 2017 where 2,400 sheep died aboard one ship due to overcrowding, heat exhaustion, and lack of food and water, which is how these sheep are transported. There was a short ban at that time following an expose, and then a few months later the practice resumed, and it is ongoing today. And so the money that is spent in the United States to purchase lamb and sheep meat and to get the shank bone for the Seder plate is going to support the kinds of practices that I've been talking about and many more that are very painful and damaging to the bodies of sheep and lambs. And I want to just take a moment and compare the fact of these 2,400 sheep dying of exhaustion and thirst to the story of Moses and how he was selected as a leader of our people. Now I want to pivot for a moment to another element of the Seder plate, and that is an egg. And so the egg on the plate is, as a symbol, is meant to represent fertility, spring, the cycle of life, and that is because the birth of an animal, as represented by the egg, is a joyous and beautiful moment for all animals, including humans, but especially for mothers. And so on the next slide, I want to talk about how Jewish tradition is very specific about treatment of mothers and specifically of mother birds. There is a mitzvah, a commandment in the Torah, that if you are to take eggs from a mother bird, from a nest, you must send away the mother because she will experience emotional pain at the loss of her children. Mother birds, like all animals, including humans, love and care deeply for their young. And so Judaism commands us directly in the Torah that we are responsible for the emotional suffering that these animals undergo. Now again, how does that compare to the reality? On the next slide, you can see that in factory farms is uniquely heinous. You can see here an image of the battery cages that hens are forced into. Like the female sheep I talked about earlier, they are made to overproduce in very painful ways. They suffer debeaking, which is a method of keeping them from pecking at each other. That's something chickens only do if they're very stressed. Instead of alleviating that stress, the response of the industry has been to perform a painful surgery on them, just like it is in the case of sheep. And you can see the conveyor belt here. The way that the eggs are taken from the mothers is in direct violation of the Torah commandment. They do see their eggs being taken immediately from them. And in the industry, male chicks are useless. And so they're killed immediately, and in very graphic and horrible ways that I won't get into here. But the mother hen is suffering both from the physical realities of her short life. Mother hens generally don't live past 2 years of age, when naturally they would live between 15 and 20 years. And they are suffering immense emotional pain in the ways that they are watching their children being taken and killed in front of them. So I also want to just take a moment. We get this question a lot at Jewish Veg about what about kosher meat? Wouldn't a kosher facility make sure that these things are not happening? And unfortunately, the kosher meat industry and egg industry is the same industry as the non-kosher industry. The animals are coming from the same place. In the case of a kosher slaughterhouse following to the letter of the law, all of the rules of kashrut, which unfortunately is very difficult, and the case in Postville can point to this and to the fact that it's not a system that was made for an industrialization of the system. Even in the case that it were true that it was followed to the letter of the law, a kosher death does not equal a kosher life. The same animals who are suffering so much in the way that they are raised by the industry, those are the animals who are going to the kosher slaughterhouses. And so even if they were to be killed in accordance with kosher law, there are still so many violations of Jewish law and kosher law to that point that really, as we say at Jewish Veg, kosher meat is not something that is made or available today. So what is the solution in preparing for your Passover Seder? This is a page from the Jewish Veg Vegan Haggadah, which is going to be on sale shortly, and we will send you a link following the webinar. And so on this page, we go into actually all of the elements of the Seder plate and what they represent when keeping in mind animal justice. In our case, I just want to talk about the two I've named so far, and that is the replacement for the shank bone, which is in many cases a roasted beet. That substitution, that particular substitution, dates all the way back to the Talmud. You can find it in the Talmud, and it mimics the blood of the sacrifice. Calls to mind what that shank bone is meant to represent without causing harm to any actual animal. Similarly for the egg, at Jewish Veg, we like to use a flower, which shows the beauty of the natural world in bloom, again, without contributing to any pain or misery of egg-laying hens. There are also other elements that you could use, like a boiled potato is one, but we like to use the flower at Jewish Veg to really show the beauty of the natural world and how important it is to preserve it. And on that note, I would like to pass it on to Hannah to talk more about climate justice.
Thank you, Sarah. And I didn't prepare a biblical story to share with you all on this, but just as Melissa and Sarah have talked about the human elements and the animal elements of this journey, I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the impact that this might have on our Earth. And so, with that in mind. So we hear a lot about climate change these days and what that means, but oftentimes we don't really understand how that actually translates into what's really going on. So we can think of the Earth similar to how we would think of our own bodies. We might be able to handle a tiny bit of temperature fluctuation, right? We put on a jacket or we take some clothes off, but when we have a fever, it can be really damaging to us, particularly if it is prolonged over a long period of time. And we could say the same thing about the Earth. A few degrees of warming can actually have a huge effect on the health and wellness of everyone on the planet and everything. Taking into account the natural mechanisms that influence climate, we know that human activity is responsible for 100% of the global warming that has occurred since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And I lead in with this because I guess I should introduce myself. My name is Hannah Henza. I work for Hazon. And right now we believe that we are in a global climate crisis and Jewish tradition compels us to respond. So leading with these facts of like what's actually happening to the world around us and how we've contributed. One of the things that we have particularly wanted to look at is how our own behaviors, particularly in our expression of Jewish culture in the United States, feeds into some of this warming. And one of those ways is absolutely in our consumption of animal products. And that plays so beautifully into this narrative that we're discussing around Passover and how to think more equitably around both the celebration and the Seder and all of the elements sort of leading up to and throughout our time together during the holidays. So one of the things that we know is that our planet has become a farm for the production of animal products, right? Melissa and Sarah talked so well, not beautifully, but very, very graphically about what that actually means. And one of the things that means is that 59% of all arable land is used for the production of animal feed. That is land that could be used to feed people and is instead being used to feed animals. We also know that in 2018, that's the last year that we have numbers for, more than 99% of the animals eaten in the United States were raised on factory farms. We can go to the next slide. Factory farming is an issue for a number of reasons, but we could trace the history back to really the 60s with what many people call the Green Revolution. It was a time in which we were trying to industrialize the production of food all over the world. And instead we increased drastically the amounts of nitrous oxide and methane that we were producing and putting into our atmosphere. And we have this sort of metaphor here about the atmosphere as a budget, and we can think about inputs and outputs. But the short summary is that there's only so much that our atmosphere can take, and we know that some of the largest negative chemicals, methane, nitrous oxide, carbon dioxide, that are being poured into the atmosphere that are polluting our planet are coming from our food choices. So we also know that those are choices that we have direct control over and that we can actually stand up and make a decision about. So we've talked a lot about what industrial meat and dairy do to the animals themselves, but there's a huge connection between those practices and our global ability to handle pollution. So we know that animals eat, they digest, and then they produce methane. They burp it out, they fart it out, they pass it in a lot of different ways. It's just part of the nature of being alive. And so this is quantifiable. You can go take a look at this on many sources, that livestock is one of the leading sources of methane emissions in the world, followed by nitrous oxide, which is also produced by livestock emissions. And those are two of the largest sources of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere right now that are kind of clogging it up. We also know separately that trees are what we call carbon sinks. And a carbon sink means that it's a resource that is able to absorb toxic chemicals in the atmosphere and actually safely store them or process them or keep them away from harm. And so with trees, that's often, carbon dioxide. They consume carbon dioxide and produce oxygen, which is beautiful. But they also have a process of storing that in their root system and down into the soil in a place that is not harmful to our earth. Sorry, I'm seeing a comment. So we also know that separately, one of the largest sources of deforestation in the world is for grazing animals for the consumption of meat and dairy. Forests are being torn down all over the world, both in the United States, but particularly in regions that don't necessarily have the protections over land that we might have here. And so we hear a lot about the rainforests being torn down or other large forests on other continents in Southeast Asia or in South America, or sometimes we hear about it on the African continent, being torn down specifically to graze animals, which of course takes away that carbon sink. So what's something that we can do? We can change our diets. We know, like I said, about 80% of deforestation occurs specifically for the grazing of livestock, for the consumption of animal products. We also know that as this is one of the leading causes of climate change, I love this line, we don't know if for sure if it is a leading cause or the leading cause, but we know absolutely for a fact that we cannot address climate change without also addressing animal agriculture and the way in which we are eating. So changing how we eat will not be enough on its own to save the planet, but we absolutely are not going to be able to reverse the situation without changing how we eat. So of course, this is another question that we often have around climate action is taking action, but which action do we take? Many people have heard of Project Drawdown. We reference this a lot at Hazon. It's one of the most comprehensive plans of action that is published right now and is continually being updated for how to actually globally work together in order to tackle this issue. And what they've pointed to is some of the 4 highest impact things that we can do are switch to a plant-based diet, which we've talked a lot about, and then reduce our travel and some other things. Of all of the things that they recommend, eating a plant-based diet both not only immediately addresses the outputs that are the methane, the nitrous oxide, the carbon dioxide that are going into the atmosphere, the greenhouse gases, but it also is one of the only ways that we have direct, easy, everyday, 3 times a day choice over how we are relating to the climate crisis and how we are choosing to stand up not only for the individuals and the animals, but for our planet as well. It's a choice that we get to make every day. And with that, I will hand it back over, I think, to Lisa.
Thank you. I want to thank Rabbi Isaiah, Melissa, Sarah, and Hannah for your lessons. You all did a great job. We are going to do some Q&A now. We want to hear from you what questions you have. So in order to ask questions, if you could please type them into the chat box, and Alana is going to be monitoring the questions and passing them along to us so that we can answer them. So I'll give everyone a moment to type any questions you have.
Great.
And thank you to those of you who introduced yourself. It was good to hear from you.
And just a little timeline after this, we'll just jump back to talking about some action steps and resources, and then we'll finish up. So if anyone has any questions, put them in the chat. So a question that Laura asked is, she said, does anyone else have a problem with the bleeding of a beet? And she said she uses a wooden lamb.
That's a really interesting question. So there are 2 reasons that we do use the beet itself at Jewish Veg, because one is to have, there's a rule to have 2 cooked foods. So roasted beet is one of the 2 cooked foods. And yes, the bleeding of the lamb is a little disturbing. Personally, at Jewish Veg, we kind of feel that the disturbance is something that we do need to address. We are very disturbed by that as people who care deeply for animals and for their lives. And so in having that symbol there, it gives us the opportunity to discuss how this is something that is actually very disturbing. That said, having a wooden lamb is absolutely acceptable and something that I would recommend for somebody who also wants an animal-free Passover plate. So I think either way is great. That's just the reason we use the beet at Jewish Veg.
And since there's not so many people jumping in and typing in, if people just want to speak and ask your question, you're welcome to do that. You don't have to type it in. Also, we would love to hear from you if any of you have developed other customs or items for your Seder plate to remove the ones that we were suggesting.
You know, I would also be curious, are there folks who are thinking about like, what are the tensions of some of of what you might be gathering from the presentation, from different folks sharing from different perspectives? I think like we all have, you know, we're all really trying to draw a sensitivity around this topic through our presentations, but then I also think, you know, from our families and our loved ones, like what are their relationships to like what the presenters shared, and our communities or our synagogues, like I just like the question of tension of like, how do we organize around reframing Pesach not necessarily as a holiday of the lamb, but a Passover that's free for all, you know?
I wrote this article recently for Hazon about my experience with raising goats and then being part of the slaughter of one of the goats that I raised. And I shared it with my community in our synagogue newsletter and got some pretty, I don't know, people were not happy with it. They felt like, you know, there should have been a trigger warning, or they just didn't think it was something that should have been shared on a newsletter. It was a little too much for them to handle. I didn't go too into detail. You could see the article if you want, but it was pretty emotional. And, you know, we're going to have a second night community Seder, assuming we will still have it with the virus and everything. And there's going to be brisket, you know, there's going to be meat, and it's enough people that it's not affordable to buy the cheaper or the more expensive meat that is pasture raised and all this. So I'm like kind of afraid to raise these issues when we're about to eat all this stuff. I know that we need to challenge people to think, but I just don't know what the right, I don't know when I can. It's like there's no context. People keep saying, well, you can't talk about it here. You can't talk about it here. And it's sort of like, when can we talk about it? And I don't know that you guys have an answer for that, but.
Well, what I can tell you, if I may jump in here, is that Jewish Veg, Shamayim, and JIFA all have programs that directly address how to have a large-scale gathering like that from a plant-based perspective. So we at Jewish Veg, we offer something called Vegan Option Always, and that's a program where you can offer a vegan option either alongside a meat option or in place of, as obviously we would prefer, but either way, if you're offering a vegan option to your attendees and guests, that gives you a great opportunity to address that issue and gives you a chance to talk about why that is there and let them make the choice of what they would really like to do in that moment. I think it's really important to address that discomfort and to have people in your community talk about these issues, and we're not going to get anywhere unless we're able to have that conversation. So even in the cases where people are uncomfortable, I think it's a good teaching moment to be able to say, you know, if this is causing you discomfort, what can we do with that discomfort? What is the way that we can address that? And if you're interested in getting some materials, we are going to be offering a resource sheet following the webinar, and you can also reach out to any of us and we can provide you with some direct help on those issues.
Lisa had asked a question. She said, you all gave great information about animal agriculture. Can you please address why small farms with grass-fed animals are also problematic. I don't know if Melissa wanted to jump on that one first, but anybody's welcome.
Yeah, I want to respond, and thank you, Lisa, for that question. I think it's worth giving a little context here, especially for the context around the purpose of this webinar. So we have 4 organizations presenting here. Not all of us are specifically coming from the lens of Jewish vegan animal ethics. However, we're working together from a common mission-aligned goal of helping our communities eat more in line with our values, eat more sustainably. And to that end, I'm actually so proud of us as a Jewish community. Like, this is not even something that happens in the secular animal protection world as often, coming together, even though we have slightly different platforms and methods of engagement. So JIFA and Hazon are 2 organizations that engage a broader spectrum of advising communities and working with communities on doing kind of a less and better strategy, eating fewer animal products, sourcing them from higher welfare sources when possible. But again, for a little context, you brought up pasture-raised animals, animals that might be raised in what we might consider, the best of the best way. And there's only one kosher company in the whole United States that even raises pasture-raised beef and poultry. So I think it's important to remember that, at least I should say on a commercial level, that ships nationally. So that's important context, because when we talk about, okay, well, what about the higher welfare options? The reason why we want to host this webinar is because we are talking about the vast, vast majority of the system. And we are talking about just Passover in the sense that Passover feels like such an appropriate launchpad for talking about these issues and enacting our values just for the Seder, right? We're not necessarily talking about the whole of Passover, although we encourage you to extend that to the whole of Passover and beyond. But it's one night that we get together with our community or together with our families or friends and get a chance to engage these issues more deeply. So while I think it's important to talk about what our options are if we're omnivores and looking to eat more in line with our values, the reason why we wanted to have this webinar was specifically to talk about how we might engage those issues and reflect that in our practices on Pesach specifically. So I hope that addresses your question. And if anyone wants to talk more offline about higher welfare animal products, I think Hazon and JIFA would be happy to do that.
Hi, this is Valerie. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Awesome. Is there going to be some kind of what's the word I'm looking for? A resource where I could go. I'm willing to drive. I live in Lakewood, Colorado, to go to a vegan Pesach where there's not eggs and shank bones. It would be really nice if there was a resource where we could, drive if we want to California, whatever, and go to a Pesach where there is no animal stuff.
I love that question. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to mention our vegan Passover Seders that are happening in 4 cities across the country. So we have one in Los Angeles, we have one in New York City, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. So we are also hoping to expand in future years, so maybe we will come to Colorado. But yes, we do offer fully vegan Passover Seders, and we would love to see you there. We'll be giving you a link at the closing of the webinar, but we would love for you to come to our website and check that out.
Awesome. And we had another question. It's a good one. It's a big one. Laura asked, people have made the connection between violence against animals and violence against women. Do we have any comments about that?
I want to give someone else a moment to jump in before I take this question.
Yeah.
After you talk, I was have something to say too.
Oh, did you want to, was that Valerie again? If you wanted to,
yes,
to finish up. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, I thought you were done.
At the Shamayim Institute retreat, which I totally loved, and it completely changed my life in so many wonderful ways. Sunday morning, I was with a lady and the 2 twin sons. I forget their names, but
this is the Said brothers.
Yes, right. He saw that I was wearing a wool vest, and he said, "Did you know that the wool industry is very abusive?" And I said, "No, because every video I've seen is a cute little lambykins, and they're petting him, and they're very gently taking the wool off." And so he went undercover and he showed me video, and it was so horrible, and it still is just, it's in my head every day. But these men at this factory were throwing the little lambs down, cutting off their tails, shearing them, just cutting off their tails and kicking them. And then the next lamb, and they would throw them down. And the lamb were looking at these men like, "Why are you doing this to me?" And my thought was, okay, these guys are going home to a wife and kids. Oh my God. It just really made a huge impression on me. So I'm just like total 100% vegan now. I went to a JNF meeting last night, which I totally support, Jewish National Fund. There's cheese and crackers. I didn't do the cheese. I'm so glad I went to the Shamayim Institute, because it really opened my eyes. But in light of what you were saying about abuse to women, and what are those men doing to their kids and their wives? Oh my God. Yeah.
Well, thank you for the plug for the Shamayim retreat. We will share with everyone a little bit more about Shamayim when we get to our resources section. But yeah, there's a lot of connections here to all these things, as I think all of our speakers kind of tied it together. So Sarah, do you want to go ahead and respond to Laura's question?
Yeah, so I think I did try to address this in some ways in my slides as well, but I think that what it comes down to in the animal agriculture industry is that female bodies are seen as being for the purpose of reproduction, and that is a very toxic and very pervasive view of how animal bodies are made to work, and that includes human bodies. And so that kind of biological essentialism and kind of reproductive pain and objectification of female animal bodies is very much the same as it is upon female human bodies. They support each other, and in the ways that we make female sheep overproduce in order to provide lambs, that we make female hens overproduce in order to provide eggs, they're only seen as useful for those productions. And that kind of concept, like going back to what Melissa talked about as the web of violence, anything that is being visited upon the bodies of animals in that sense is also influencing the way that we think about the bodies of human animals. And that is a very, very important connection to make, and one that I'm really glad that that you made and that I had the opportunity to make somewhat in the slides.
And I just put something in the chat, but for those of you who aren't seeing the chat, if you want to learn more about that intersection and connection, you can check out a book called The Sexual Politics of Meat by Carol Adams.
Before we move to our action steps and resources, is there any other question?
I have a question. This is Shayna Goldman. I'm located in Boston. My question is about the halakhic ruling about having to have two elements on the Seder plate being cooked. And I see a lot of people online looking up just various alternatives for the egg, saying that you can use an avocado pit, but that obviously wouldn't, like, you wouldn't cook that, right? So that doesn't necessarily align with the halakhic standard. So I'm just curious as to how that works out, or is there just another alternative that you would recommend? I've seen like flowers being used, but again, that doesn't, you're not going to cook the flowers likely. So just curious as to anyone's thoughts on that.
I don't know if Rabbi Isaiah, if you want to comment as well. One thing that you could use is rice. Cooked rice is an option that I've seen for that. And as well, I mean, depending on how you want to prepare the Seder plate, there are ways to cook other elements of the Seder plate. So like haroset, for instance, if you could consider that cooked. But in terms of specifically following the halakhic rule of having two cooked foods, the one that I see mostly is the roasted beet and the rice.
Yeah, I think I would just add, like, in certain respects, everything that we do at the Passover Seder is Zecher LeChorban, is Zecher LeMikdash. It's there to really remind us and commemorate what our ancestors did when the temple stood, connecting it back, and even before, not necessarily to the Torah's perspective of Pesach, which is very much an agricultural holiday. So the rabbinic frame is what we're really showing up with during these 7 days. And in that way, the Pesach sacrifice has been discontinued, and there's no actual obligation on a biblical level. And so everything that we're doing is in ways a symbolic claim. And even from the context of Jewish law, when it comes to having these different symbols, there's a spectrum of how one could come to decisive halachic rulings on whether you even need any meat at the table, especially if it would cause discomfort or harm to people's experience of the holiday. In terms of like, to my knowledge at least, like most of the things that people have created as halachic rulings around the holiday function around also what the quote unquote minhag Yisrael is, what the communal norms are and what's normative, and what people have been doing. But we also know that there are several cases both in the Gemara that talk about when there's no matzah, or when there's no, like, there's always situations where there's a reflection of what the reality is for the community or the individual. And so, and again, it's highly symbolic to remember what the Paschal sacrifice was potentially, but not necessarily to actually like do anything that would be considered that. Anyway.
Yeah. Do you mind if I respond to that, or do you guys want me to move on?
You can respond.
Okay. Thank you for that. That's helpful. As much as that, I think what you articulated very much makes sense to me. I'm one of 2 vegans in the community, and we're trying to demonstrate that we can still uphold, more general, less progressive halakhic norms, and just infuse what we currently know to be the present halakha with vegan ideals and values. Like, we can't just, like, we're trying to fit and say that, like, our vegan values can be part of the current structure and system in our community, which isn't going to lean towards kind of restructuring and reconfiguring what the norms can be in our community. I'm kind of trying to say, like, we don't need to, like, throw the baby out with the bathwater kind of thing. Like, we can still live and be in community with the norms that we have, instead of making it some bigger deal and say, let's just choose the beet and the avocado pit or some other cooked alternative and not have to change the whole system. Because that's going to be like a non-starter for our community. That's pretty conservative and really has pushed back quite a bit at times on vegan ideals. Does that make sense?
Just a couple of things about the Seder plate. So there's 6 items, as you know. 2 are symbolic, and 4 you actually use or consume during the Seder. The 4 that you consume are plants. The 2 that are purely symbolic are the shank bone and the egg. Because they're symbolic, halakhically, and I'm speaking somewhat generally here about halakha, but halakhically, you can replace them with other symbols. The beet is fully halakhic. It's actually mentioned in the Talmud as an acceptable replacement. The egg, it's a bit trickier because in Judaism, in the rabbinic tradition, there's no consensus about exactly what it symbolizes. There's actually debate. But if it's so, nobody is correct and nobody is wrong.
And that, by the way, is Jeffrey Spitz-Cohen. He is the
executive director. Michael Griboff.
Oh, you're Michael Griboff. All right. But he's the executive director of Jewish Veg.
Yeah.
In the interest of closing on time, I'm going to thank everyone for their questions and answers. And also, I see that Essie just posted a comment that I think is important for everyone to keep in mind as well. So thank you for that, because that's definitely an important point to remember. We are going to now just discuss a couple of action steps, which Alana is going to share with us.
All right, can everyone see the screen again?
Yeah.
Great. So I hope everyone enjoyed our presentation today and learned something new. So as Lisa said, I'm just going to share a quick few action steps and our resource guide that we're going to send out, and then each organization is going to quickly have a chance to share their resources, and then we'll finish up. So if you can take away just 3 action steps from what we learned today. The first would be finding a substitution for the egg and the shank bone on your Seder plate. The second is to look at our recommended supplements that we'll send out after this presentation and see if there's one or a piece of one that you'd like to include in your Seder this April. And then 3 is we hope you really enjoyed seeing the celebration of freedom and liberation of Passover in a new way today. And we really encourage you to share these thoughts and questions and challenges with colleagues, friends, families, coworkers, so that we can grow the size of the group having this conversation. So we hope you'll continue thinking about and discussing how we can truly celebrate freedom while so many of us aren't free, and our role in the system that helps keep it that way, and how we can change that. So please share what we've discussed with 8 people in honor of the 8 days of Passover. So that's just having one conversation a day, which I think is pretty doable. So that would be a great way to share this message and spread it as widely as possible. The picture of the one-pager you can see on the right-hand side here is what we'll be sharing with you. So you don't have to remember the substitutions we mentioned for the egg and the shank bone. That will be on there. We'll also have our Haggadah supplements, and then some vegan, completely plant-based Passover recipes you can use, and only I think one of them has kidney oat, so the rest are completely kidney oat free. I also wanted to do a quick plug. I'm teaching a class about aligning our food choices with Jewish values in the Chicago suburbs. My first class was yesterday. It was really great, and we'll have 2 more in the next coming weeks. So if you happen to live in Chicago or the suburbs, or know somebody who does, this will be in the northwest suburbs of Chicago, if you could write your name and email in the chat and just say you're in Chicago, I could send you more information about that, but I didn't want to spam everybody who doesn't live in the area. So with that, I will pass it along to Lisa. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Alana. So the announcements from Shamayim about things that you or your congregations or communities could be a part of are that we are really excited, and this is the first time we're announcing it, we're going to be having an animal welfare sermon contest. And what we're asking is for your rabbi or lay speaker to write and deliver a sermon talking about what the Torah has to say about our requirements to care for non-human animals. Non-human animals. We're going to have a $360 prize, and we will have a panel of judges judging those sermons. We are going to be putting information up on our website really soon about that. Also, please take this back to your congregations, or if you're here representing one, Shamayim is going to be opening our applications for the 4th cohort of the Synagogue Vegan Challenge, where you receive training and grants from us on providing vegan food throughout the next year in your congregation. And then finally, we'd love to have you stay in touch with us and keep posted on all of these programs and offerings that we're doing by signing up for our newsletters on our website and following us on Facebook and Instagram. And the links will be live in the follow-up that you get.
Okay. And so at Jewish Veg, we have a number of different things that we are doing around Passover specifically. As I already mentioned, we are having 4 fully vegan Passover Seders in cities across the country. So the link for that, jewishveg.org/Seders, you will be getting that as well in the resource sheet. We're going to have a vegan Haggadah that's going to be available for purchase online. It will be at that same link. You will be able to purchase it there. So keep an eye out for that. One of the best ways to get notifications of when you can purchase that will be signing up for our newsletter at jewishveg.org. We're also on social media. And we have an online store if you're looking for Passover recipes that are vegan. We have an amazing book called the Vegan Start Passover Cookbook, and you can purchase that on our site at jewishveg.org. Same place you can sign up for our newsletter, learn about the Haggadah, and find out about the Seders near you.
Hey all, so for JIFA, next week, we have another webinar coming up that we're co-sponsoring with Hazon. And I really encourage you to join. It'll be a bit different. It's going to be exploring the ecological roots of Passover with Rabbi Ellen Bernstein, who just came out with a really lovely new Haggadah called The Promise of the Land. And we'll be discussing some similar aspects in that if you are hosting a Seder where you use this Haggadah as a supplement or engage with some of the ecological themes of the Haggadah, Rabbi Zaya and I will be suggesting ways that you can align those values with your practices at the Seder itself. But I encourage you to come. Rabbi Ellen is just such a beautiful, beautiful educator, and she'll be kind of diving deep into some of the scholarly background and the themes behind the agricultural foundations of Pesach. We'll also be rolling out, re-rolling out and rolling out new Haggadah supplements in the next week. So be prepared to receive an email with those. They're not out yet, but they will be out and available for free download. And they'll be engaging specifically the meal. You might remember that at Shulchan Orech, there's no specific teaching for the meal. So this will give us an opportunity to engage some of the values and talk about some of the issues more deeply that we discussed today around the meal at the Seder itself. And we encourage you to check out and join our Jewish Leadership Circle. As a member, you'll receive free consultation for your Jewish institution to adopt more sustainable and humane sourcing practices around your food. And you can check that out at the link listed here. And we also encourage you to incorporate conscious food choices into your communal programming with resources for B'nai Mitzvah, for adult text study, and more. And there's a link to our resource hub up as well.
Yeah, and I thank you. I just want to thank Lisa for helping really pull us together and keeping us strong and organizing this. I really, really appreciate it. Also, I want to thank Sarah, Alana, Melissa. It's been awesome to do this with you. And I also want to thank Hannah for sharing words on climate justice for Hazon, specifically resources on our end, I would say, and, and action steps. We have, our resources on Passover, on Pesach on our website, also including some how to make the Seder more sustainable and environmentally conscious, and then also specifically recipes. And then we have our campaign that we've been doing this entire year, 5780, which is us really considering our choices through the framework of environmental tshuva, of considering our actions, our choices, reflecting on how we can create an environment for ourselves, for our community that's thinking about mitigating climate change. And then also a lot of the content that Hannah had shared today could also be seen through a similar lens and a different lens through Jonathan Safran Foer's book, We Are the Weather. If you're interested in getting a copy of that, reach out, let us know. We'll try to get you a copy, as well as we have our discussion guide put together by our colleague, Becky O'Brien, that you'll also see. Another final thing that we'll say is that if you or your institution's interested in some consulting and figuring out how to create a roadmap to become more sustainable as a community or institution, please let us know. And our Seal of Sustainability program, also Hannah on this call, who directs that, will be in relationship. So I think that's a little bit from us. Thank you again. And Chag Kasher V'Sameach, as they say, it should be a kosher Passover. And I know that in the frame of what we've discussed today, we hope that we can push back on the narratives of what kosher looks like, and meaning, as we like to say, a chazon, kosher being fit to eat, and what really is or isn't fit to eat.
Thank you. Thank you so much to everyone for teaching. Thank you to everyone for joining us. You will get an email from me shortly with those recipes and resources. If you use them, please take pictures and share them with us. We would love to see them. And again, as everyone has said, we are all here to be resources for all of you. So please feel free to reach out if we can help you in your efforts or figure out ways to have those conversations. So thank you so much, everyone. Happy Passover.
Thanks, Lisa. Bye.
Thanks, y'all. Bye.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everybody.
everyone.